Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We are now going to begin the second unit of our semester, which starts with Chapter 7, reviewing blood. So please follow along in your lecture notes as well as your slideshow so that you can make your own notes on your slides. And we're going to be beginning on Roman numeral number 1, composition and functions of blood. All right. So, first we need to understand what whole blood is and exactly what constitutes whole blood. What is inside of the blood that is coursing through your cardiovascular system, okay? What do we know about blood on a basic level? We know that it's a fluid, and we know that it's red, and we know that if we get injured, it's going to leave our system, and it's very important for the functions of our lives, all right? Blood is delivering oxygen and nutrients throughout the body and is providing those substances for our active body tissues to continue to do their job, all right? Every single muscle, every single organ, every single gland in our body needs oxygen and nutrients in order to perform their job. And that's what the role of blood is, to deliver those oxygen and nutrients to every single cell of our body. It delivers those nutrients in blood through the vascular system. Okay, so we have a network of these tubes throughout our body. These tubes are called vessels or blood vessels, right? As they go further and further away from our heart and into smaller and smaller areas of our body, these blood vessels get smaller and smaller and smaller, okay? But because of the unique property of blood, those little tiny cells that are inside of the blood can fit into pretty much any single area of our body, all right? So let's take a look at what whole blood looks like, okay? So if you were to go to the doctor and if you were to get a blood sample taken, right? So the nurse will go in, they'll take a needle, they'll put that into a vein in your arm, and they'll withdraw blood, fill a blood tube, and then that tube might be sent off to a lab for further testing, right? If you were to look at the blood tube, it looks like a pretty normal mixture of this red fluid solution, okay? So this is what we call this is what we call whole blood, okay? If you were to take a close-up look of what a sample of blood were to look like, you'd see it's a mixture of a few different major components, okay? There's this liquid component called plasma, and inside of that liquid component, you have these formed elements or these cellular elements that are floating around in the liquid plasma. The major formed or cellular elements that you will find inside of this liquid medium are leukocytes, erythrocytes, and platelets, okay? However, to the naked eye, you can't see these items. You can't see these cells floating around in the liquid medium. To the naked eye, it's just going to look like a homogeneous red solution. In order to visualize what the different components are of whole blood, you need to introduce, you need to introduce this blood tube into a centrifuge, which you can see right over here to the right. Okay, so what does a centrifuge do? A centrifuge, you can put a blood sample right into this little machine, and it's going to spin it around and around and around and around really, really fast. And it's going to continue to spin for about, I don't know, 5 minutes. After 5 minutes, you're going to find that the various components of whole blood has begun to separate. Okay, and it's going to look something like this. Okay, you're going to see 1, 2, 3 different layers of the whole blood. All right. So after this specimen has spent time in the centrifuge, it is going to separate, and it's going to separate into its various components based on weight. Okay. The heaviest cells are going to the bottom of this tube, while the lightest of whole blood will stay at the top. All right. So if we're to look at a little bit more closely these individual sections of what whole blood is, okay, 55% of it is composed of plasma, okay? So you can see over half of your whole blood is composed of plasma. And what is plasma really? Plasma is a mixture of water, dissolved plasma proteins, as well as some small solutes such as um, ions, hormones, and other types of nutrients dissolved into this liquid medium, okay? So that makes up a majority of your whole blood is this liquid, all right? Now, the second component, which you can see here, only makes up 1% of your entire whole blood, is called the buffy coat. Within this buffy coat, or this middle layer, you're going to see two different cell types. You're going to see a platelet and a leukocyte. We'll get into a little bit more detail on the next slide about exactly what these are and their functions, but these are the first two cell types you're going to see in the blood. And then the final cell type you're going to see, which is at the very bottom and accounts for 44% of whole blood volume, are erythrocytes. An erythrocyte is another name for a red blood cell. And that's the cell type that we're really going to be focusing on in this chapter as we move through. We're going to be focusing on what the function of the red blood cell is. We're also going to be focusing on how platelets can aid and contribute to the process of blood clotting. So let's go into a little bit more detail about the formed elements, or these cellular elements here, as well as the role of our liquid component, or the blood plasma. Okay. So our whole elements. All right. Remember, this is about 44 to 45% of our whole blood. And the best way to be able to visualize this percentage is by spinning whole blood down in that centrifuge so it can separate into its constituent parts, okay? So what is included as part of our formed elements? The first type of formed element we have is called a platelet, okay? So a platelet only really accounts for less than 1% of our total cellular or formed elements. Now, when I'm saying a formed element, I'm referring to anything that's considered a cellular fragment or a whole cell inside of the blood. It is basically anything that is not considered blood plasma, okay? So anything floating inside of the blood plasma that looks and acts like a cell is considered a formed element, aka a cellular element, okay? So what is a platelet? This very first one. A platelet is really just a cellular fragment. It doesn't have any organelles. It's a very basic cell type. It's really just a cell membrane surrounding cytosol with a couple of specialized proteins inside of the cell. So it's not a true cell. It's more of a cellular fragment. Okay. And what is the role of the platelet in the blood? It aids in blood clotting. Okay. So if you were to get an injury, an internal or an external injury, that process is going to activate these platelets. These platelets will become very sticky and they start to clump together. As they clump together, they are going to slow down the loss of blood from your body. If you lose too much blood from your body, you are not able to survive. You go into a state of shock, which will eventually result in death if it is not taken care of, okay? The loss of blood is going to reduce the transport of oxygen and nutrients to all of your organs, your muscles, your other body tissue, and then they're not going to be able to survive or function. So platelets are very important in whole blood because they help aid in this process of blood clotting or stopping the loss of blood. We're going to talk about that more at the end of our chapter, okay? Now, the second major blood type, blood cell you're going to see inside of the blood is called a white blood cell, okay? A white blood cell accounts for, again, less than 0.1%. While the number is very few for white blood cells, these are very important. These white blood cells, which are also called leukocytes, okay? So leukocyte is another word for a white blood cell, WBC, okay? These guys are very important because they are our immune system cells, okay? These guys circulate throughout the body within the blood, and they're helping protect you from infection, and they provide you immunity so that in case you do encounter a deadly bacteria or virus, your body can mount an immune response and fight off that foreign invader so that it does not take over your body and make you sick, okay? The immune cells can also be manipulated in the creation of a vaccine, okay? A vaccine will basically stimulate your white blood cells to begin producing these protective agents called antibodies that will protect you in case you are exposed to a novel virus such as the coronavirus. And we'll talk about the immune system and white blood cells in our immune system chapter 9 section. But for the time being, I do want you to know that a leukocyte is a white blood cell, and this is a type of immune system cell that circulates throughout the blood, and its role is to fight infection as well as provide immunity. You're going to see there are 5 different types of white blood cells. You don't need to know those individual types at this point in the semester or for this particular chapter, but just have that in the back of your head that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different types of white blood cells, okay? Now, the last type of formed element we're going to discuss is the red blood cell. This accounts for 99.9% of the cellular elements inside of whole blood. So this is the largest component of blood. So blood is primarily composed of red blood cells. The other name for a red blood cell is an erythrocyte. Okay, so erythrocyte is another word for a red blood cell. Okay, now what are their jobs? Their job is to circulate oxygen throughout the body. Okay, they will bind to oxygen in the lungs. And then they're going to deliver that oxygen throughout the body to all the different body tissues. So transports oxygen to the body tissue. And then when I'm saying body tissue, I'm referring to basically any cell inside of your body that is composed, that comes together to create all of your individual muscles, your organs, your glands, your bones. Anything inside of your body is considered a body tissue. All of that body tissue is metabolically active, it's alive, it's performing work, so it's going to need oxygen. If you think back to our chapter previously, at chapter 3, the structure and function of the eukaryotic cell. Remember, oxygen is used by the mitochondria to create ATP. And ATP is that form of energy that the cell uses to do work, right? So oxygen for the human body is required at for every single cell at the cellular level. All right, so it is the job of the red blood cell to deliver that oxygen from our external environment. Okay, we breathe the air in. This air in our atmosphere is oxygen rich. It goes down into our lungs. And in the lungs, the red blood cell is going to pick up that freshly inhaled oxygen and then deliver it in the blood system or the cardiovascular system to all of the cells within our body. Okay, so that is the major job of the red blood cell, and which is why it comprises a majority or the 99.9% of the cell type found inside of the blood. All right, so those are our three formed elements: platelet, leukocytes, and erythrocytes. Now let's look at the liquid component of whole blood. The liquid medium that these formed elements are sitting in and traveling in is called plasma. All right. Plasma is about 55% of the whole blood volume. So about half of your whole blood is cells or cellular fragments. The other half is this liquid medium called plasma. If we're to look at plasma a little bit more closely, we're going to see that a majority of it, or between 90 to 92% of plasma, is really just water, okay? So this is why such a large percentage of our entire body is composed of water, because look at how much water is just in the blood alone, okay? 92% of this liquid plasma is comprised of water. So what makes up the other 8 to 10% of human blood for this liquid component? Well, you have these plasma proteins that are dissolved in the water, and these plasma proteins have a very specific job, okay? So let's review some of our plasma proteins here. The first one we're going to talk about is albumin. Albumin's job is to help maintain blood volume. Okay. So blood volume is how much blood you have in your body. If your blood volume drops, by default, your blood pressure will also drop, okay? If you have a full glass of water, that's exerting a certain amount of pressure against the glass cup, okay? That water is pushing out against the glass and it's exerting a certain amount of pressure. Now, if you drink half of that water, there's going to be less volume and less pressure that water is exerting against the glass, okay? Against its container. You can think about blood and volume in the same way. If you're reducing the volume of blood, you're reducing what is inside of a blood vessel, and thereby you are reducing the blood pressure. So that's what I'm referring to when I am saying either the blood volume or the blood pressure, because they're directly related. Okay, so how does this little plasma protein help maintain or keep up the blood volume inside of your body? We're going to go back to our chemistry chapter, and I want you to think back to the process of osmosis. Okay, so remember, osmosis is the movement of water towards an area of high solute concentration. Okay, so inside, let's say, the blood, we have these little plasma proteins called albumin. Okay, so these little plasma proteins are dissolved inside of the blood within the plasma component, okay? Because they're these proteins, we're going to have a high solute concentration and a relatively low water concentration, okay? So if we start to lose blood volume, we are effectively decreasing water volume, okay? So if we lose blood volume, we are losing water, okay? Any water that is present inside of the tissue will then follow its own concentration gradient and go from the tissue into the blood, okay? This is called an osmotic gradient. Why is that important? That's important because the body is just going to follow this natural cue that if it loses too much blood or if it loses too much water, it's going to naturally start to pull water from the tissue to ensure that it is not reducing the blood volume, okay? The only reason that this is happening, this osmotic gradient is established, is because of the presence of this albumin, okay? Or this plasma protein that is allowing water to enter to maintain that blood volume, okay? So that is the first plasma protein. The second one is called a globulin, okay? So the role of a globulin is to bind to proteins. It also allows proteins to travel in this water-based solution we call blood. Remember when we were talking about various molecules and particles that were either hydrophobic or hydrophilic, meaning water-loving or water-fearing. Just because something is water-loving or water-fearing doesn't mean that our body doesn't need it. We just need to have mechanisms in place that is going to allow for the transport of those water-fearing solutes, all right? So if blood plasma is composed primarily of water, we need a way for various proteins that are water-fearing to be transported. And that's going to be accomplished by binding to a globulin, right? So globulins bind to proteins, which allows them to travel in the blood, okay? So as proteins as well as ions, hormones, lipids, these are all substances that need a little bit of help to go through this water-based solution because they are water-fearing. So once they attach themselves to a globulin, they basically have a little taxi cab that's going to drive them from point A to point B without fear of interacting with the water, okay? Then the final plasma protein you're going to see inside of plasma is fibrinogen, number 3, fibrinogen. And what does fibrinogen do? Fibrinogen is an inactive clotting protein. Okay, and its job is to help in the process of blood clotting, all right? Or you can also think of it as helping to prevent blood loss, okay? So fibrinogen is in constant circulation in the blood, okay? And it's circulating as an inactive clotting protein, okay? If this was actively circulating, or if this was circulating in its active form, that would be very dangerous for you as a person, because then you are constantly having issues where your blood is clotting for no reason. If you have a blood clot develop for no reason, that can easily cause an obstruction in your blood flow, which could lead to a stroke. Okay. You could also create a blood clot, which then would get stuck in smaller vessels, causing a thrombosis. Something like that could basically stop further blood flow to your heart and to your lungs. Okay. So that's a very dangerous situation to be in. You don't want your body just spontaneously creating blood clots. It should only be creating a blood clot if an injury is present, okay? So this inactive clotting protein called fibrinogen is only activated by injury, okay? So injury will activate protein. Once the fibrinogen is activated, there is a cascade of events that occurs that will eventually lead to the creation of a blood clot. This blood clot is created by the platelets, which will stick together, okay? So this fibrinogen activates and it causes the platelets to become sticky to stick, all right? So these sticky platelets will clump together and form a blood clot. And we're going to talk about this whole process in the last half of the chapter about how a blood clot is created. But I just want you to understand that this protein, fibrinogen, is considered a plasma protein and it's in constant circulation, okay? So for your exam, you should know these three plasma proteins and a generic function, just very simply what the role of each one is, okay? Albumin is to regulate and maintain blood volume. Globulins are there to help transport proteins, and fibrinogen is there to help the process of blood clotting or coagulation is another word for it, okay? So those are your major components for blood. In the next video, we are going to start talking about red blood cells or erythrocytes. We're going to speak about their structure and function.